mathematical biology, we have the following house rules. This online workshop is recorded. Your participation means that you are giving consent to be recorded. Kindly edit your display name to first name space last name underscore affiliation. Participants are muted by default. Please stay muted and turn off your display video to allow speakers to present and to watch presentations without interruption. For questions, you may use the chat box. Type your question and the speaker whom you prefer to answer. Questions will be entertained during the open forum. Your thoughts matter to us. Don't forget to fill out the evaluation form to help us improve the conduct of our future online workshops. The link will be posted in the chat box. Be on time, be prepared, be attentive, and have fun in the IWOMB 2021. To have a full and meaningful experience in this international workshop on mathematical biology, we have the following house rules. This online workshop is recorded. Your participation means that you are giving consent to be recorded. Kindly edit your display name to first name space last name underscore affiliation. Participants are muted by default. Please stay muted and turn off your display video to allow speakers to present and to watch presentations without interruption. For questions, you may use the chat box. Type your question and the speaker whom you prefer to answer. Questions will be entertained during the open forum. Your thoughts matter to us. Don't forget to fill out the evaluation form to help us improve the conduct of our future online workshops. The link will be posted in the chat box. Be on time, be prepared, be attentive, and have fun in the IWOMB 2021. To have a full and meaningful experience in this international workshop on mathematical biology, we have the following house rules. This online workshop is recorded. Your participation means that you are giving consent to be recorded. Kindly edit your display name to first name space last name underscore affiliation. Participants are muted by default. Please stay muted and turn off your display video to allow speakers to present and to watch presentations without interruption. For questions, you may use the chat box. Type your question and the speaker whom you prefer to answer. Questions will be entertained during the open forum. Your thoughts matter to us. Don't forget to fill out the evaluation form to help us improve the conduct of our future online workshops. The link will be posted in the chat box. Be on time, be prepared, be attentive, and have fun in the IWOMB 2021. To have a full and meaningful experience in this international workshop on mathematical biology, we have the following house rules. This online workshop is recorded. Your participation means that you are giving consent to be recorded. Kindly edit your display name to first name space last name underscore affiliation. Participants are muted by default. Please stay muted and turn off your display video to allow speakers to present and to watch presentations without interruption. For questions, you may use the chat box. Type your question and the speaker whom you prefer to answer. Questions will be entertained during the open forum. Your thoughts matter to us. Don't forget to fill out the evaluation form to help us improve the conduct of our future online workshops. The link will be posted in the chat box. Be on time, be prepared, be attentive, and have fun in the IWOMB 2021. To have a full and meaningful experience in this international workshop on mathematical biology, we have the following house rules. This online workshop is recorded. Your participation means that you are giving consent to be recorded. Kindly edit your display name to first name space last name underscore affiliation. Participants are muted by default. Please stay muted and turn off your display video to allow speakers to present and to watch presentations without interruption. For questions, you may use the chat box. Type your question and the speaker whom you prefer to answer. Questions will be entertained during the open forum. Your thoughts matter to us. Don't forget to fill out the evaluation form to help us improve the conduct of our future online workshops. The link will be posted in the chat box. Be on time, be prepared, be attentive, and have fun in the IWOMB 2021. To have a full and meaningful experience in this international workshop on mathematical biology, we have to have a full and meaningful experience in this international workshop on mathematical biology, we have the following house rules. This online workshop is recorded. Your participation means that you are giving consent to be recorded. Kindly edit your display name to first name space last name underscore affiliation. Participants are muted by default. Please stay muted and turn off your display video to allow speakers to present and to watch presentations without interruption. For questions, you may use the chat box. Type your question and the speaker whom you prefer to answer. Questions will be entertained during the open forum. Your thoughts matter to us. Don't forget to fill out the evaluation form to help us improve the conduct of our future online workshops. The link will be posted in the chat box. Be on time, be prepared, be attentive, and have fun in the IWOMB 2021. To have a full and meaningful experience in this international workshop on mathematical biology, we have the following house rules. This online workshop is recorded. Your participation means that you are giving consent to be recorded. Kindly edit your display name to first name space last name underscore affiliation. Participants are muted by default. Please stay muted and turn off your display video to allow speakers to present and to watch presentations without interruption. For questions, you may use the chat box. Type your question and the speaker whom you prefer to answer. Questions will be entertained during the open forum. Your thoughts matter to us. Don't forget to fill out the evaluation form to help us improve the conduct of our future online workshops. The link will be posted in the chat box. Be on time, be prepared, be attentive, and have fun in the IWOMB 2021. To have a full and meaningful experience in this international workshop on mathematical biology, we have the following house rules. This online workshop is recorded. Your participation means that you are giving consent to be recorded. Kindly edit your display name to first name space last name underscore affiliation. Participants are muted by default. Please stay muted and turn off your display video to allow speakers to present and to watch presentations without interruption. For questions, you may use the chat box. Type your question and the speaker whom you prefer to answer. Questions will be entertained during the open forum. Your thoughts matter to us. Don't forget to fill out the evaluation form to help us improve the conduct of our future online workshops. The link will be posted in the chat box. Be on time, be prepared, be attentive, and have fun in the IWOMB 2021. To have a full and meaningful experience in this international workshop on mathematical biology, we have the following house rules. This online workshop is recorded. Your participation means that you are giving consent to be recorded. Kindly edit your display name to first name space last name underscore affiliation. Participants are muted by default. Please stay muted and turn off your display video to allow speakers to present and to watch presentations without interruption. For questions, you may use the chat box. Type your question and the speaker whom you prefer to answer. Questions will be entertained during the open forum. Your thoughts matter to us. Don't forget to fill out the evaluation form to help us improve the conduct of our future online workshops. The link will be posted in the chat box. Be on time, be prepared, be attentive, and have fun in the IWOMB 2021. To have a full and meaningful experience in this international workshop on mathematical biology, we have the following house rules. This online workshop is recorded. Your participation means that you are giving consent to be recorded. Kindly edit your display name to first name space last name underscore affiliation. Participants are muted by default. Please stay muted and turn off your display video to allow speakers to present and to watch presentations without interruption. For questions, you may use the chat box. Type your question and the speaker whom you prefer to answer. Questions will be entertained during the open forum. Your thoughts matter to us. Don't forget to fill out the evaluation form to help us improve the conduct of our future online workshops. The link will be posted in the chat box. Be on time, be prepared, be attentive, and have fun in the IWOMB 2021. To have a full and meaningful experience in this international workshop on mathematical biology, we have the following house rules. This online workshop is recorded. Your participation means that you are giving consent to be recorded. Kindly edit your display name to first name space last name underscore affiliation. Participants are muted by default. Please stay muted and turn off your display video to allow speakers to present and to watch presentations without interruption. For questions, you may use the chat box. Type your question and the speaker whom you prefer to answer. Questions will be entertained during the open forum. Your thoughts matter to us. Don't forget to fill out the evaluation form to help us improve the conduct of our future online workshops. The link will be posted in the chat box. Be on time, be prepared, be attentive, and have fun in the IWOMB 2021. To have a full and meaningful experience in this international workshop on mathematical biology, we have the following house rules. This online workshop is recorded. Your participation means that you are giving consent to be recorded. Kindly edit your display name to first name space last name underscore affiliation. Participants are muted by default. Please stay muted and turn off your display video to allow speakers to present and to watch presentations without interruption. For questions, you may use the chat box. Type your question and the speaker whom you prefer to answer. Questions will be entertained during the open forum. Your thoughts matter to us. Don't forget to fill out the evaluation form to help us improve the conduct of our future online workshops. The link will be posted in the chat box. Be on time, be prepared, be attentive, and have fun in the IWOMB 2021.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فقال ربكم ادعوني أستجب لكم آمين يا رب العالمين الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين اللهم اجمع شامل المسلمين والكريستيان والأمة في مدينة دباو وسلم دائما مجتمعنا هذا بالسلم والأمن والتقدم في بلدنا هذا آمين يا رب العالمين ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب ربنا إنك أنت الوهاب ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار وصلى الله على خير خلقه سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين آمين يا رب العالمين.
In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Our most gracious Heavenly Father, we come to you today to praise and worship you and give you thanks for all the things you continue to provide for ourselves and our families. Father, we humbly ask for forgiveness for all the times we have offended you, when we forget to acknowledge your presence in the image of our brothers and sisters, and for moments we fail to be good stewards of the blessings you have given us. Continue to guide and protect each one of us, Lord, that we may always walk in the light of your everlasting love and mercy. Grant us, Father, with your comfort in times of distress and with your strength in times of weakness. Bestow upon us your unending grace and healing, that me in turn become instruments of gentleness and compassion to others. We ask all this in the name of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, with the prayer and the intercession of our Blessed Mother. Amen.
Manama, mawantog ka. Warag po ko iling koy ko. O Diyos, kahibulungan ka. Busa ikaw lang ang simbahon ko. Busa ikaw lang ang alagaran ko.
Mga kababayan, ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas.
Good morning, Philippines, and hello, world. I am Chai.
This is Ken, and welcome to IWOMB 2021.
This year marks the 4th International Workshop on Mathematical Biology with the theme Strengthening Decision Support System for Better Public Health Policy through Infectious Disease Modeling.
We will listen to research talks from world-class mathematical biology experts about topics from modeling real-world systems, space mapping approach to disease dynamics, uncertainty and error in COVID-19 epidemiological parameters, optimal control theory to inform infectious disease management, and the use of partial differential equations to explore in silico plant pest invasions.
Participants will also attend workshops on introduction to numerical methods for stochastic models, multi-scale modeling, understanding disease dynamics using panel regression approach, applications of location allocation models, introduction to mathematical epidemiology, and spatial-temporal patterns of infectious diseases.
There is so much in store for us here in IWOMB 2021. Personally, I am honored to be part of this annual event and excited to learn more and expand my knowledge on mathematical biology.
That's right, Ken, and we are thrilled for that. This time, we will hear a welcome message from the IWOMB 2021 Committee Head, an Associate Professor of the University of the Philippines, Mindanao, and the Department Chair of the Department of Mathematics, Physics, and Computer Science, UP Mindanao. Let us hear from Dr. May Ann Mata.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I want to acknowledge the presence of our esteemed keynote speakers, Dr. Joma Rabahante and Dr. Teal Kruger, the plenary speakers, Dr. Yusuf Mameri, Dr. Wolfgang Bock, Dr. Aurelio de los Reyes V, Dr. Alejandra Donahi Herrera Reyes, and of course, Dr. Alistair Jamieson Lane, the very own Chancellor of the University of the Philippines, Mindanao, Dr. Larry Digal, to our workshop facilitators, my colleagues and fellow academicians, to the 70 selected participants for this year's workshop, and to everyone who is watching our live stream right now, and to all aspiring mathematical biologists or biomathematicians, a very, very blessed day to all of you. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the 4th International Workshop on Mathematical Biology. In the last 4 years, the Philippines has hosted this international workshop, started from Cebu, Bohol, to Laguna, and now Davao City. This might not be a face-to-face workshop like before, but we still made sure that we have assembled our distinguished professors and researchers from all over the world to show and teach you the beauty of mathematical biology. This year's workshop topic, Strengthening Decision Support System for Better Public Policy through Infectious Disease Modeling, is inspired by the current pandemic that we are on. It has already been more than a year since this started, and we know that countries across the globe have different approaches in assessing and implementing measures to minimize the spread and even eradicating the virus itself. Government officials are in this motion together with our healthcare personnel. At this point, we now have an understanding that each one of us has an important role to play in building resilience amidst this pandemic. Being researchers in the field of mathematical biology, we cannot help but be passionate about how we can link our knowledge and expertise in helping the decision makers arrive at informed decisions with our current circumstance. This year, I am humbled to share with you one of the initiatives that resulted from this passion, and that is the establishment of the first research center in Mindanao dedicated to health research that uses interdisciplinary quantitative approaches coupled with improved disease surveillance techniques. This center is dubbed as the Center for Applied Modeling, Data Analytics, and Bioinformatics for Decision Support Systems in Health, or AMDABIDS Health. This center is funded by the Department of Science and Technology under the Niche Center in the Regions for Research and Development. This online event is actually made possible by the creative team in this center, together with the International Workshop on Mathematical Biology Organizing Committee. Instead of a virtual applause, may I ask you to show your support to the organizers by visiting and hitting likes to the social media accounts and website that are flashed on the screen. The purpose of this workshop is to introduce you to infectious disease modeling and how it could be a good foundation in creating public health policies. With data that are acquired by different sectors, what can the academic and research sector formulate? What can we give back to help with the battle of not only COVID-19, but also to every infectious disease or potentially new or re-emerging diseases? We prepared for you several topics for that, and we hope that we can inspire you through this online workshop. Well, I would not want you to wait much longer since I know that you are already anticipating the workshop part of this event. I know you guys are really excited, and I hope you all enjoy everything that we have prepared for you on this 3-day workshop. Once again, good morning and welcome to the 4th International Workshop on Mathematical Biology.
Thank you, Dr. May-Ann. This time we will listen to another welcome message from the Chancellor of the University of the Philippines, Mindanao, Professor Larry N. Digal.
Distinguished guest speakers, workshop facilitators, professors and researchers from different parts of the world, university officials, faculty, staff, and students, participants from various organizations, workshop organizers, friends, ladies and gentlemen, good day and welcome to the 4th International Workshop Mathematical Biology or IWOMB 2021. This international workshop would not have been possible without the dedication and hard work of a niche center in the regions for research and development in the University of the Philippines, Mindanao, also known as UPMin, which focuses on deriving insights from analyzing health-related data at different levels using quantitative methods, data analytics, and applied mathematical modeling approaches, which can generate relevant decision support systems for local governments and public health officials. I commend Professor May-Ann Mata, leader of the program on applied modeling, bioinformatics, and data analytics for decision support systems in health, Professor Lair Ani Murao, program director of the Philippine Genome Center, Mindanao, Professor Von Carlo de la Torre, and Dr. Jernalyn Logrosa of Malayan Colleges, Mindanao, who are all project leaders of this NICER UPMin program. Of course, the members of the IWOMB organizing committee who are joining us in this workshop also need to be acknowledged for starting the IWOMB 2018. Carrying the theme, Strengthening Decision Support System for Better Public Policy through Infectious Disease Modeling, this workshop aims to promote state-of-the-art mathematical biology researches in the country. Hopefully, this workshop will be able to tackle important issues on infectious disease modeling that will benefit our public health sector, particularly in responding to present and emerging infectious diseases. In addition, this workshop is a great opportunity for local researchers to establish research collaborations with potential partners both locally and abroad, and to sustain the initiative to build a mathematical biology community and even a professional organization in the field in the near future. I wish everyone a fruitful workshop in the next 3 days. Mabuhay at maraming salamat.
Thank you, Dr. Larry. And finally, we will hear a welcome message from the Mayor of Davao City, the city where UP Mindanao is located. We have Honorable Sara Duterte Carpio.
Madayaw ug maayong adlaw kaninyong tanan. Taking part in this 4th International Workshop on Mathematical Biology, spearheaded this year by the Niche Center in the Regions for R&D, University of the Philippines, Mindanao. With the timely theme, Strengthening Decision Support System for Better Public Policy through Infectious Disease Monitoring. This year's gathering highlights the integral role of mathematics and research and development in helping decision makers, especially with the current challenges brought about by COVID-19 and other infectious diseases. This is a great opportunity to showcase how the academe, data analytics, and applied mathematics can help us arrive at better decisions to protect our communities from infectious diseases. So I ask everyone to make the most of this seminar so that you may continue to blaze the trail in your respective fields and contribute to making the world a safer and better place for all through mathematical biology. Daghang salamat, mabuhay po kayong lahat, and may God bless you all.
Thank you, Mayor Sarah, for your welcome message. This time, we will watch an audiovisual presentation on UP Mindanao in celebration of its 25th anniversary. This UP Mindanao institutional video will give you a bit of an idea and a quick tour in our university. Let's all watch this. We are supposed to have you here in Davao City in UP Mindanao if not for COVID-19. But research never stops in mathematical biology, and so we are here virtually on IWOMB 2021. Now we will watch another AVP on the highlights of IWOMB 2020 held on January 2020 last year at UP Las Bañas in Laguna. Once again, let's all watch this video. I was there in the IWOMB 2020 last year, and it was really a fun and meaningful experience. And this time, I will do a roll call. And as I call your name or affiliation, please give us a thumbs up reaction so we can recognize you. So again, we will do a roll call. And as I call your name and your affiliation, please give us a thumbs up reaction so we can recognize you. So we will start with our keynote speakers. So our first keynote speaker is Dr. Till Kruger. And our another keynote speaker is Dr. Joma Rabahante. For our plenary speakers, we have Dr. Alistair Jamieson Lane. Another plenary speaker is Dr. Wolfgang Bock. And then we have Dr. Alejandra Herrera Reyes. Our next plenary speaker is Dr. Aurelio de los Reyes V. And then finally, we have Dr. Yusef Mameri. So those are our speakers for this year's IWOMB. Also, we would like to recognize our organizing committee headed by Dr. May Ann Mata and for the rest of the organizing committee. We'd also want to recognize our participants Do we have participants from Luzon? Kindly give us a thumbs up reaction. Our participants in Luzon. How about our participants from the Visayas? And of course, our participants from Mindanao. And lastly, to our live stream audience, welcome to IWOMB 2021. Okay, so I know everyone is excited to listen to research talks on mathematical biology. So without waiting any longer, let's listen to our keynote speaker for today. So our keynote speaker is Dr. Till Kruger. He's currently a professor at the Wrocław University of Science and Technology. He's a graduate of the Humboldt University in Berlin, and he received his PhD studies at the University of Bielefeld. His research works and interests are on mathematical modeling in medicine and biology, stochastic processes, complex networks, and dynamic systems. So let us all listen to Dr. Till Kruger. Dr. Till, good morning from the Philippines.
Good morning. I put my, have a little bit morning background here. And I'm excited, to participate in this conference and also be the first speaker here. And so let me do the screen sharing. I just have to click here that I'm agree to be recorded. And you have to give me the ability to share my screen.
Yes, Dr. Till, for a while.
All right.
I guess you can now share your screen, Dr. Till.
Yes. How does it work? Keynote. And you should see here my screen. Okay.
This is a small test to see if
sorry. This was
slideshow will correctly be recorded. And I go over to the next slide. What's here? Forecast hub.
Sorry, I have to switch off because I played previously recorded things, which is not the right thing to do. So let's deadly do it again. Now this here. And I have now play on this Mac. Okay, so you can see all my screen. And you can hear me. Just give me a response.
Yes, Dr. Till, we can hear you clearly.
Yeah, so I will speak about, mostly what we did here since the beginning of the COVID-19 epidemics in terms of model building, or some aspects I would like to concentrate here. And I have chosen the more mathematical side, not so much the simulation side, but as a motivating example, I will say a few words about the practical applications of epidemic modeling, especially in the context of COVID-19 pandemic, which somehow shakes the world since more than a year. And the picture you see here is a snapshot from what's called the German-Polish forecast hub, which is now merged into a European forecast hub. And if you Google European forecast hub, you will easily find the links. And on such page, which is similar existing in the United States, different groups, and for Germany, it's about 40 teams, and for Poland, it's a little bit less, about 20 teams, try to give predictions up to 4 weeks for the number of cases and the number of deaths. And there is a huge variety of mathematical models. There are groups from Oxford, from MIT, international groups, local groups, and everybody tries the best somehow to give the prediction. And it turns out that it's actually a pretty hard thing to do. And what you see here is somehow the 4 weeks predictions together with the confidence bound. And the black line, which you see a little bit below here, is the real number of cases, weekly accumulated cases for Germany. And you see that most models have, at least at certain time points of the epidemics, pretty much either underestimated, like you see from the beginning here, or overestimated the course of the epidemics. One of the very good prediction model is actually the average of all these models, which is called the ensemble prediction. And it's usually better than individual models. I want just to show how the situation looks for our own model, the MOCOS model, which we do for Poland here. And on the left side, you have predictions 2 weeks ahead of number of cases. But you see also we have overshooting in the autumn wave here. And then we stayed pretty good, actually, within the 50% confidence bounds around the median, which is shown here with the real curve. And for the deaths, you see a similar picture. We had a very much overestimation of number of deaths in the second wave in last autumn, but which was somehow due to the fact that due to the many deaths Poland had in the second wave, they stopped somehow really counting all the COVID deaths, and we had a huge excess mortality, and which probably is attributed to entirely to COVID cases. And this amounted to number of deaths which were only seen in the Second World War at this time here. So a very dramatic situation, and Poland somehow had one of the worst excess deaths at this time in Europe. And then the prediction became pretty good. Now, so a natural question arises, what type of models you would like to use for such predictions, and what is somehow you look at what is on the market. And what you see is, well, that most of the models are actually relatively homogeneous ordinary differential equation models. And there are some extensions to stochastic differential equations and partial differential equations. And then there is this more somehow complex group of agent-based models, which usually require a lot of computer power to run them. I will speak about these models, and there is a certain reason why. I mean, the main point, what I want to say, I will in a few minutes explain. Now, the aim of all models is, of course, to understand and to uncover conditions for outbreaks, so understand the epidemic threshold and how it depends on certain structural parameters. And the second thing is how to control and to spread of the disease, so sensitivity analysis, non-pharmaceutical intervention, impact, and so on. And then, of course, the prediction of the incidence and the prevalence, at least for the nearer future. And then still scenarios and all this kind of stuff, which is used to a large extent today in policy advice to health institutions in each country. Now, the pluses and the minuses of an ordinary differential equation versus an agent-based models are somehow pretty, lie on the hand, I would say. So the ordinary differential equation models have the advantage that they are precisely and easy to describe, right? You just write down the equations and that's it. They are also easy to simulate, and they're also relatively easy to analyze. Yeah, you know what you have to do. You can do stability analysis of the stationary point and the endemic equilibrium, or the whether it's in subcritical epidemics, whether the epidemics will go extinct. But what is difficult to add heterogeneity, which is actually a good part of our real life contact structure and which has an impact on the epidemics. Now, all what is easy to do in the agent-based thing is usually in the ODE is usually difficult to do in the agent and vice versa. So in the agent-based case, it's easy to add all types of heterogeneities, but already to describe precisely the model takes usually quite a long amount of time and an amount of space. You have many parameters, and as more parameters you have to tune them. And it's usually believed that they are essentially not really suitable for a deeper mathematical analysis, and that they are computationally very expensive. You need a supercomputer or a very, very good cluster of computers to run them really and to search, for instance, in the parameter space. On the other side, ODE models are limits of agent-based models, right? We will probably hear some talks here about scaling limits of this type. I think Wolfgang Bock will eventually speak about this. And I would like today a little bit make the point that this general belief that agent-based models are too complex for a mathematical deeper understanding and analysis is actually not true. And I will somehow demonstrate this a little bit on the case, mainly on the case of the impact of household structure on the epidemics. So let me start with a few general remarks about agent-based structures of agent-based models. So you have agents, individuals with individual properties, and you have type-dependent contact structure that you want to actually bring into the model. You have a random individual gambled out a progression of the disease, and you may have time and process-depending change of environment. And you can describe very complex countermeasure like contact tracing and things like that, which is very hard or essentially impossible to do in a realistic way in a homogeneous differential equation model. Now, epidemics takes place on networks of contacts. So what essentially all agent-based models try to incorporate is a certain type of representation as a random underlying network, the contact structure which is relevant for the spread of epidemics. And so you always have to deal with such a network. Now, I will concentrate here on a network which is actually a subgraph of the real contact structure, since we are only interested in the infectious links when two individuals in a society have a contact and one person is infected. We only count the edges which are really in transport and infection. So this is called the infection subgraph, the infection graph, and it's a subgraph of the contact structure, of course. Now, for the what you add now on the mathematical side, you have a type space, so you have which accounts for the heterogeneity of the agents you have, and you have a state of the individuals which somehow describes the progression of the disease once an individual is infected, and then you have a function which is usually called a kernel, which defines the probability of contacts between two individuals, ing. And then you still have transmission probability, which might depend on the infection state of the individuals, and everything, because the state somehow tries to counterplay the epidemics and takes certain actions, everything might depend explicitly on time. All right. So the first thing you have to understand actually in epidemics is the phase transition. And the phase transition is related historically also to another field in mathematics, which is called percolation theory, which was first studied on lattices actually. And this theory deals with the remarkable phenomena if you have a lattice structure and you somehow have a probability P somehow to keep an edge between neighboring nodes on the lattice, then if this probability to have an edge between two neighboring nodes is above 1/2, then a so-called infinitely connected component appears. That means a connected structure which contains infinitely many nodes. And if the probability that there is an edge between two nodes is less than 1/2, and all the edges are independent, then the whole network splits into small disconnected components. And if edges represent the realization of an infection process, if this graph splits in many, many small components, then of course, an infection starting in a component will only infect a relatively small number of cases and will not widespread over the whole population or society. And that's why the structural phase transition, which was first described in population theory, is at the essence actually of epidemic, of understanding in epidemics. Now, lattice structures are relatively complicated to understand. So fortunately, for most application epidemics, you don't have to deal with lattices. You can take a little bit simpler random structure. And the people who pioneered this were Hungarian mathematicians, Erdős and Rainy, I will say a little bit. And they came up with a very, very simple model. They said, well, we have, say, a large number of nodes representing individuals, and now we do the same thing as in the lattice, but we do it just between two arbitrary nodes, right? They have a certain probability to be connected. And the parameter really on which we look at is how many neighbors you have, right? This is this parameter R here. If a node has, say, 3 neighbors, then its individual number of neighbors, the degree in graph terms, would be 2. And the R is the average number of neighbors you have in this connectivity structure of a graph. And you see an interesting, really a remarkable phase transition. If the mean number of neighbors is less than 1 on the left side, the graph splits into many, many small connected components. And as soon as you go a little bit above 1, the emergence of a giant component is visible here, and which very, very quickly accounts and accumulates and attracts all the nodes in the graph. So the aim of all intervention measures in an epidemics is actually to break the connectivity structure, to come over this phase transition where the graph really splits into many, many small components. And the people who first understood this and worked out the mathematical basics were two Hungarian mathematicians, Paul Erdős and Alfred Rainy, in the 50s and 60s of the last century. And they explicitly calculated what is the phase transition. It happens exactly at when the mean number of neighbors is 1. And they described the size, how large the largest connected component, the so-called giant component is. Now, this theory has largely been extended, especially in the last 15 years. And involving much, much more structure than in this relatively homogeneous Erdős-Rainy graph. And that makes this type of generalization very suitable as ground networks or base networks for realistic heterogeneous networks as they appear in real-life applications like we have in epidemic networks, in epidemic contact structures. So what is the setting here? You again have n vertices representing your population. N is usually very large, and individuals have now arbitrary features. Which are values in a n-dimensional space or some ground space, and you define the connectivity structure again via a kernel function, which somehow tells you, taking the features of 2 individuals, you evaluate the function in these 2 arguments, and then divide it by n, and that gives you the probability that there is an edge between I and j. Right, so on the right side, I have depicted here, you can imagine different colors correspond to different features. different values of xi that can be discrete, can be continuous parameters, can be many, can be high dimensional feature space, what you attribute to the individuals, and then you make the probability that there is a link between two different agents dependent on their features, right? So what you see here is the red one are mostly linked to the red one, and the blue one are a little bit to the green and the blue one, but not to the red one. So you can put a lot of structure into such networks with the help of so-called kernel functions and a proper distribution of features in your population. Now, it's actually surprising how many of these features you can attribute into individual features. So the age, the gender, the profession, the household size, the work status, and so on, but also features which somehow describe the progression of the epidemics in case you become infected. So you can a priori assign to individuals the incubation time, for instance, time from becoming infected to becoming infectious, or whether you get tested or not tested. These are things you can actually attribute in advance and attribute and put them into the feature vectors. So like wearing mask or not wearing mask. That might be modulated over time, but essentially you can assign this in the beginning of your as features into your feature space. Good. So the local structure, and that is somehow an important thing, and it's the only feature which is somehow taken over in this generalization from the classical Erdős-Rényi model, is that edges are independent, right? They are not with the same probability. Probabilities depend on features, but as in events, whether there is an edge or no edge, they are independent. And that makes these graphs essentially locally tree-like. So here on the right side, I have somehow shown if you would start here at the level 0 with a node and would somehow look at its neighbor, has two neighbors, and then you go to their neighbors, then you go somehow a distance 2 from the picked up node you start with, and so on. And you see it's essentially a tree structure which emerges here. Later on, this tree structure, of course, gets cycles and it doesn't become a tree. So globally, the graph is very, very unlike a tree, but locally it is a tree. And this local trees, actually, you can describe mathematically very well with a so-called class of processes, which is called branching processes. Now, and all what you have to know is to define this branching process is somehow a stochastic process which generates this tree is this kernel function here, right? You can compute the expected number of neighbors depending on the type of an individual. So the lambda of x, you just integrate over all possible neighbors, the whole population, and take the kernel into account, and then you get the expected degree or the expected number of neighbors you have. And so there are some kernels which are very popular to use here as network structures, and there is a big variety of them. Now, this tree structure is actually described the key mathematical structure which you have to look at to understand especially the phase transition where the giant component appears is the so-called transfer operator. And the transfer operator essentially describes you, if I type X feature, what is the induced distribution of features of my neighbors, right? And that depends, of course, on my kernel here. So somehow it tells you how you transport, if conditioned on an individual's feature, how somehow the distribution, the conditional distribution of features in the next generation of my neighbors and then I can iterate this and go on. So the kernel itself is somehow a transition matrix, you could say. And interestingly, the only quantity which really is decisive about the phase transition, the epidemic phase transition, whether there will be a large outbreak when you put an infection in or not, is the norm of this transfer operator, which is a linear operator in a Hilbert space. If the norm is larger one, there will be a giant component, and if the norm is less than one, all small components are very small compared to the total size of the population, so you don't get in epidemics. Furthermore, this norm can be interpreted, what in epidemics is called the basic reproduction number, which is the number of secondary cases which a typical individual, infected individual, will generate. So this is actually the right interpretation or the right way to calculate this reproduction number in a heterogeneous structure where people have many, many different types of people you have in the population. You have to look at the norm of this operator. Good. Furthermore, what is also relatively easy to compute now is the total number of people which eventually get infected once an epidemic starts and it's overcritical. So if the norm is larger than 1, then you have to solve a nonlinear integral equation, transcendental integral equation actually, where in the exponent of this exponential is this transfer operator. So it's an integral here. It's numerically very easy actually, because the right side is a contraction. So you can really just start with a constant function equal 1, and then you iterate it, and you converge very quickly to the right solution. And that gives you the probability that an individual of type X will be a member of the giant component. And this equals also the probability to get eventually infected if an epidemic outbreak would happen. And then integrating over all the individuals rho X and weighting it with the corresponding frequency that this type X is present in your population, you get the relative share in the population of people which will eventually get infected, right? So this is all very well and nicely worked out theory, not yet very old one. It's just somehow 15 years ago. This extension was made by Bollebash, Janssen, and Riordan. That's why I call them BGR graphs. And in a very, very deep and also very long paper. And these are somehow the main results. So to recall it a little bit, and now I have already in mind that I'm not only dealing with symmetric curves, but also with directed, which naturally appear actually in epidemics. Here you have to choose the L2 norm to the spectral norm, but it's still the same criterion here, a norm criterion which tells you whether you have overcritical, supercritical epidemics or subcritical epidemics, and where the phase transition is. And to understand the epidemic amounts actually to understand how the norm of this operator depends on your parameters on which you can do something, which you have an effect on. So how its medical parameters and intervention and social structures impact the norm of these operators. That means essentially understanding the epidemics. Good. For directed graph, things become a little bit more complicated, but not very much more complicated. What you have now is essentially two natural transfer operator, because you can look as a branching process in the direction. So you have now directed edges, and you from a node on, you can somehow go with the direction of the nodes. But you can also start in a node and somehow look how edges are incoming, so against the arrow. And that defines a second somehow backward in time branching process you could understand. And that's actually this, so it's just the adjoint transfer operator. But the interesting thing is that this backward in time process actually is the relevant transfer operator when you want to compute how many nodes eventually get infected, right? So this probability to get infected is the solution of this equation, which is here at the bottom line in my slide, but with the backward process, which is just the adjoint of this forward branching process operator. Now, what is interesting is that in many applications, and I have made just here one application, which is called, I call super spreading application, this backward process is actually much more simple than the forward process, because somehow in the backward view, you somehow average over a lot of structural or inhomogeneities in your population out, and you see only the mean. And I would like to demonstrate this here with something which you might interpret as super spreading events. So super spreading events are just individuals which infect a very, very large number, either because they are very infectious, or they have in the time when they are infectious, it happens they meet many people at the same time, and they all get infected. So how to model is you assign, say, a feature X, somehow an infectivity, or somehow a spreading a feature in your population, which is heavy tail distribution, say. And that makes, and then you say that the kernel is proportional, which tells you somehow also what is the average number of secondary cases an individual of type X will generate, is precisely defined like a constant times X. So an individual of type X will in fact C times X secondary cases, or generate secondary cases. And if you have X heavy tail distribution, you get super spreading event. Now, for the total number of the epidemics, and of course the phase transition is for the forward process and the backward process the same, you have to look at the backward process. But you see here in this backward process, the right side is actually not depending on Y. So it's not depending on the feature. It's a constant. For the backward process, it's only the average number relevant of your heavy tail distribution, or for the super spreading event. So the mean number of secondary cases, not really details of the distribution. So somehow you uniformize, or somehow you average out the super spreading events. They are still relevant. There are still, of course, things which depend on the distribution. For instance, outbreak probabilities. If you have a very, well, if you have no epidemics and then something comes in, super spreading can trigger and boost a little bit. But they don't impact really the overall final number of infected you get in an overcritical epidemics. Only the mean value is here of relevance. So this directed epidemics, this backward process simplifies very often life. And before you involve somehow a complicated heterogeneous structure, you should ask yourself, and this is best to do if you view it from the backward process, whether it's really necessary to include this. For instance, a feature like a time-dependent infectivity during the time you're infectious would actually average out. And you are only interested in certain structural things and phase transitions. You can ignore about this. You can equally find a model which you just take the mean number of this into account. Good. Let me come to actually my main application here, and this is household structures. Household structure play a significant role in epidemic spreading. And the reason is relatively easy to understand. First of all, households put nodes together, right? And in a regular fashion. So here I have a society, the green one, which is somehow representing links, social links or infectious links between individuals. Then the dashed line are the pairings or the groupings, which provides you into the household. And now you make out of each of these households, which consist of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 individuals, you make it somehow a supernode, right? And the red, the graph on the right side with the red nodes represents actually the household graph. So 2 households are connected if one individual in the one household is connected to at least one individual to the other household, right? And it's actually the right thing to look in if you want to understand this epidemics, not so much as an epidemics between individuals, but as an epidemics between households. And the reason for that is very much that restrictions which state imposes, whether it's up to the wearing of masks, right? That they are not really taking place in the household. People in the household somehow behave like normally, and you are forced to stick together with the people you live with. Now, on the structural side, on what is really going on the graph, households have a catalytic effect. And it's best to understand if you look, what is the probability of a link between two households of a given size? So here I have drawn a household of size 3 and a household of size 4. And you see the number of possible connections is proportional to the product of the household sizes. So 3 times 4, it's 12. And each of the edge has still an independent, say, probability that there is a contact between these individuals. So these two households of size 3 and 5 have a 12-time higher probability to be connected than a household of which two single people live, right? So here, a household of size 1, households of size 1 has just a 12th of the probability to have a link, and then also an infectious link between a 3 and a 4 household. So this can you now mathematically work out more in details, and so I have here done a little bit a simple case. You have somehow an out household number of contacts, say it's Poisson distribution, but it's actually not really relevant to have it Poisson distributed. You can have any distribution here. And the feature which I have now in my population is actually the household size, right? Individuals in the nodes in my graph become now households. And on the right side have actually shown how the advertisement go. Even in house, if you're together in your family, you should wear masks. If nobody does, the people lower picture shows actually what the reality is. And there is no really blocking of spreading in the household. Now, you have still to assume something about how likely it is to infect somebody in the household. That is usually called the household attack rate H, which I denoted here by little a. And with new k, I denoted the household size distribution. So the fraction of households of size k among all the households I have in a certain country. Okay. This can all be extended still to more complicated setting, but for clarity, I would like to stay with that. And E is the expected household size, the mean number of individuals living in the household. Now, if you put this now together and define the link structure between households, you, after a little bit thinking about this, you see you have to do a renormalization because the number of nodes in the household graph is, of course, less than the number of individuals we had previously. That's why you have to divide here by E. But then you come up with this kernel, which somehow it defines the probability that an infected household of size X will infect a household of size Y, right? You see, it's also becoming non-symmetric. And this is the relevant kernel which defines now the link structure of the infection graph among households. And below is the transfer operator. It's a rank 1 operator. It's non-symmetric, but it's rank 1. You can easily compute the spectral norm, and that's what comes out. And this is formula 5 here. And what you see is that in the spectral norm, which is the reproduction number of households, how many secondary households in infected household would actually infect, right? So if you have a household of a certain randomly chosen household, infected, and look how many other households this household will infect, this is precisely this number here. And you see that what goes in, besides the total number of contacts, infectious contacts you have outside the household, this is the C value, there is the second moment. So the average square household size divided by the household size which goes in, and this is somehow the household boost factor. This altogether is the household boost factor, which somehow enlarges your out-household reproduction number, contrary to the case when you have a population, say, where everybody lives in single household. Then this factor just disappears. And let's have a look for some countries. So Poland has a boost factor here. So this has a very high second moment and also a relatively high first moment. And this fraction is above 4. And it means this boost factor, which is somehow like a multiplier on the reproduction number you have outside your household, is actually 1.65. So it's somehow that the Polish households would, if you compare it with a single household population, would have the same effect as a virus which is 65% more infectious than a corresponding virus in a single household population. For Germany, this boost factor is not as large, but it's still a factor of 1.35. All right. Now, this we can extend now, still putting H in. I don't want to speak about this, but I want to show you a little bit, well, what is now, if you try to link it with real data, what comes out. So first of all, this is for Poland, and you see you have some regions, the red dot, which have very, very high second moments. These are the relevant quantities somehow to look at. And these are also the hotspots of the infection, actually. But we looked also how, if you compare European countries, and here I have to, sorry that the slide is only in Polish, but I will explain you what here is plotted. On the x-axis, you see precisely this ratio of the second moment and the first moment of the household size distribution. So what I had previously was part of this boost factor, right? The average squared household size divided to the average household size. On the y-axis, you see the number of deaths up to 1st of May this year, from the beginning of epidemics, the number of excess deaths per 10,000 citizens. So you not only count the COVID cases, you count also the excess death, which might be still, especially for some countries, which somehow represents also the undercount you had on COVID cases, right? And in Poland, it's almost a factor 1.6, which you have to add on the COVID cases when you're looking at the excess death. Now, why looking at the total number of deaths? The total number of deaths is, of course, proportional to the number of cases you would have. It's essentially a factor 100, you can say, 100 infected on one death. Depends still on the age distribution in the population. And then you see here the larger European countries above 15 million. On the very top is Poland, then comes Romania. In the middle branch, you have Spain, Great Britain, and France. Italy is a little bit larger in terms of the number of deaths than they actually would have from their household composition, but that's maybe also because they were the first hit country in Europe. And Germany is on the bottom line, because in Germany you have so many households which only very few people, 1 or 2 household size is very common in Germany. So they have a very much lower boost factor. Holland is doing pretty well. They have a little bit larger household size, but seemingly they managed fighting the epidemics pretty much. So what you see here is this structural factor, which comes from the differences in household size distribution, is one of the main explanatory variables when you want to understand differences in the progression of the epidemics in different European countries. So this is a little bit more countries. Here on, you can go on. You have a few outlier, Greece, Czech, and Hungary, but I don't want to speak about this. You can now add still more things like vaccination into the household, and look on the impact of vaccination, because vaccination somehow reduces the household size. And that means it's not just that the probability that you meet which will you meet is already vaccinated and hence you cannot infect him, but also reducing effectively the household sizes, because we have the immune people, it's less counting like they cannot be infected, and that reduces the household sizes. So what is somehow bad for the spreading is in the vaccination, again, intensivation factor, I would say. And this is, you can explicitly compute here. I have somehow shown how this out-household reproduction number, or the norm, depends now on the vaccination. You see, you have to reach, especially for the British variant, around 80% of the population to vaccinated to be subcritical. You can still add structures. For instance, I found it's a quite interesting thing. If people who don't want to get vaccinated, we have in some European countries like France, 34% of the population don't want to get vaccinated. Usually this very, very clear anti-vaccination opinions are infectious, in the sense that the opinion is shared with your partners, with your children, and good part of the households. We have also social data on that. And then it makes sense somehow to put this heterogeneity also into the model and say, well, denials live together and they cluster in the household. And that again diminishes the effect of vaccination. And you can somehow play a little bit around with all this computation and computing spectral norms and doing the same machinery here. Just want to show that you can do very precisely, even very, very complex heterogeneous structure to analyze. Similar things, you can look at the impact of children. They stay, for instance, at home. They don't go to school. And at least in European countries, the schools are the main source of the contacts between children. And you can explicitly somehow build this into the structure and understand now what happens with the households if only a part of the household members still is going out. And that are the adults and the children, which are only, of course, members in households where at least one adult is. How large is this effect? And you see that if you close the school in Poland, for instance, the reproduction number, the household reproduction number reduces by 23%. In Germany, is still 16%. So school closure has a relatively strong impact on epidemic progression, right? So it's a very, very considerable R reduction compared to letting children go to school. Now, let me close here with a few remarks about the timing, because what I have up to now spoken, this was only about structural aspect, but not really on the timeline, how the epidemics goes on. And actually, this is when you view again this epidemics as a percolation problem, this is called first passage percolation. So to the edges now, you somehow associate a travel time, how long it takes, and this describes precisely, an edge represents between node I and G, represents the event that if node I would be infected, he would eventually infect node J. But now you put a time still, and it tells you how long it takes that individual I would actually infect J, right? So if I becomes infected, when J becomes infected, and that you capture by assigning a travel time, a passage time to each of the edges. And for this, now you can view this as a continuous time, a branching process, the local growth of the epidemics, and this is really very well worked out. But the interesting thing is, I will, because time becomes a little bit short, I will go a little bit more quickly over this. What you can do now is you can define a distance between two nodes. And the distance between two nodes is defined precisely if a node I would get infected and he need not to be connected to J. J can be just a randomly node in the whole society. How long it takes that the epidemics eventually will infect J if J is in the connected component. So J becomes infected, but how long it will take. That tells you somehow precisely, at least in the average value, in the average way, how long the epidemics will take to run through your society. So we are interested in this, in the distribution, in this distance, travel time distance between two random chosen nodes. And here comes the theorem, and this is somehow interesting that you get such a precise theorem that actually this mean travel time, also the travel time between two random chosen nodes, which is a random variable, localizes very much around this value and converges to a limiting distribution, which you can explicitly write down. Right, all the constants here, everything is known. This lambda is the Gumbel distribution, and the W plus W minus are limiting distributions which appear in the branching process and are well understood. So you have a certain universality in the way how this mean distance depends on, is distributed, or the distance between two nodes, the timing, how long it takes that a node I would eventually the epidemics would go on to infect another node, how long it takes to infect this other node. And this you now can use somehow really describe the shape of the epidemics, right? Here we have still not yet proven the almost sure convergence, but essentially the cumulative number of infected is precisely given by the cumulative distribution function of the distribution which I introduced, which I just mentioned in the previous slide. This has some applications. You can now compare, for instance, epidemics which are somehow make different assumptions on the dark figure and the number of cases which you have already immune, maybe from a previous wave, and then you somehow can compare peak sizes of the two different epidemics without knowing the precise change, and this is a Formula 7. The time becomes a little bit short to speak a lot more about this. Good. Let me, a last word just to say what we do in the MOCOS group is, of course, this mathematical analysis, which I find quite interesting. I picked up this for the presentation today, but we do, of course, a lot of policy advising also here for Poland. Unfortunately, we are not the decision makers, but at least we tell them how things become, how bad things might become, and then usually they become bad. So we study a lot of non-pharmaceutical interventions, simulation here, and also we do the forecast things, and as I showed in the very beginning. So it's the mathematical analysis is part of this larger project of our group activity in the context of epidemics here. And here's still a few links to some references. It's not a complete list, but if you search, we have an own MOCOS webpage, you find essentially more information here. The English website is a little bit later always updated than the Polish one, but eventually it comes also here on the English side. So thank you very much, and I'm sorry that I have a little bit overtaken my time.
It's okay, Dr. Till, you're right on time. Thank you very much for your talk and for being with us early in the morning in your area. I guess it's around 4 a.m. there in Poland, right?
That's right, that's right. Yeah, tough time, that's true.
It's almost 10 a.m. here in the Philippines. So once again, thank you very much, Dr. Till, for your talk and for being with us in the IWOMB 2021.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I would like to remind everyone that questions for our speakers will be entertained later during the open forum. Okay, all right, let's now proceed to our first plenary talk.
Our first plenary speaker is Dr. Alistair Jamieson Lane. He is currently a postdoctoral researcher associated with the University of Oldenburg and University Medical Center Groningen. He received both his PhD and master's degree in mathematics from the University of British Columbia, studying evolutionary game theory and modeling the regulatory processes of cell division. His current research is focused on studying the evolution and spread of antibiotic resistance, with a particular focus on horizontal gene transfer. Let us listen to Dr. Alistair as he talks about how to build a functioning mathematical model of a real-world system.
Hello and welcome to the IWOMB conference for 2021. I'm Alistair Jamieson and I'm going to be talking to you about how to build a model. Now, I don't know how much expertise all of you have, so probably some of the stuff I'm going to be presenting will be a little bit basic, and some of it might go over your head. All of that's okay. The idea is mainly to give you a preview of the kinds of things you want to think about when you're building your own models, and maybe the kind of things that you should pay attention to while you're viewing some of the models that other people have built in the rest of this conference. Now, as a very quick introduction, I'm Alistair. I studied at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. I did my master's and PhD in Canada at UBC, studying evolutionary dynamics and how cells divide. And I'm currently doing a postdoc in Germany at the University of Oldenburg with the University Medical Center in Groningen, studying antibiotic resistance and horizontal gene transfer. Of course, with all this COVID, I'm currently back in New Zealand, which is nice. And I'll be the one who will be working with you if you happen to be doing the workshop on Gillespie's algorithm later on. So, with that out of the way, let's get started. And first thing is, let's talk about what is a model. So, say you've got something that you care about, the world as an example, and you want to build a picture of that thing so that you can make predictions about it, or say how it's going to respond to a particular stimulus, such as a change in temperature. Now, you build these pictures using equations because equations are good for making predictions with. And if you've made this picture very accurately and chosen good equations, then you're going to have a model that's going to be able to make predictions. You'll be able to say what happens when you add a certain amount of carbon to the atmosphere. How do the number of storms change if you change the temperature by a certain amount? If you add carbon, where is it going to go? And if you change the temperature, where is that temperature change going to be seen? There are two main ways of stuffing up when you're making a model. If you are bad at mathematics, you'll end up with a model that looks a bit like this because you've messed up the algebra and the lines won't actually line up and it will be bad. And if you're very good at mathematics but bad at the science of it, you're going to end up with a model that looks like this. It will be a very precise, accurate model, but it will not represent the reality of the thing that you are trying to talk about. And so it won't be able to tell you anything useful about the universe that you live in. So those are the two hazards that we're trying to avoid. Keep them in mind, but don't worry about them too much for now. So that's what a model is. Let's talk about actually how to build one. And step 0 is just, what is your starting point? The first question to ask yourself is very simply, what is it that you are trying to model? Are you trying to model a virus spreading throughout a single person's body, or perhaps a virus spreading throughout a population and community? Do you want to know where a tiger got its stripes, or why rivers are so curvy? Perhaps you're being paid to find out what shape the wings of an airplane should be, or perhaps you're trying to understand how evolution works and where we got all these strange and wonderful creatures in the world around us. There are lots of different things you can model in lots of different ways. So once you've decided what you're going to model, the second question is, who are you collaborating with? Are you working all by yourself? Are you working with your PhD supervisor? Do you have allies in some other department who have data, for example, that you want to look at? If you have data, figure out what shape it is. Figure out, is it a bunch of pointwise data? Is it spread in space? Is it spread in time? Knowing what data you're dealing with in advance will help you know what kind of model you need to build. So now that you know your collaborators and their data, you have to figure out how much time you've got. Has the hospital asked you to get back to them with predictions in the next 24 hours? Or do you have 5 years or 4 years to build an entire PhD's worth of understanding? And also, what is your goal? You know what kind of system you're trying to model, but what are you trying to find out from that system? If I'm modeling an epidemic, it's very different to say if I'm trying to find out what the peak of the epidemic is going to be compared to if I'm trying to answer the question of how quickly is it going to spread from one place to another. Both those questions are modeling an epidemic, but they're very separate goals. Alternatively, if you're modeling something, your goal might just be to explore and see what happens if you have a system set up in a particular way. Exploration is a perfectly worthy goal, but know when that's what you're doing. And then finally, once you've got your collaborators and you know what data you have and the time and your goal, you have to decide how detailed is your model going to be. If you've only got a short timeline, you want to build a simple model, probably based on other people's previous models, and keep it simple, keep it basic. If you've got a long time, or you're being asked to give very accurate results that are correct to 10 decimal places, then probably you're going to need a much more detailed model. And you're going to have to worry about things like friction and stuff like that. Knowing how accurate you have to be and how much time you have is going to tell you how much detail to put into your model. Okay, so you've started. You know what you're modeling, you have a general idea of what's expected of you. The next thing to get onto is what is in the literature. And I cannot state this heavily enough. Read the literature, read the literature, read the literature. It is something I am terrible at and never do as much as I should, but knowing what other people have made is super important to helping out with making your own model. As a few first steps for that, go and do a Google search and use Google Scholar. See if you can find a couple dozen papers that are talking about the same kinds of things that you're talking about. If you can't find any papers, that is also interesting and useful. You should read mathematical papers. You should read experimental papers. If you can, see if you can find papers with data attached to them, or look in a bunch of data repositories that exist. Data is wonderful, and lots of people have collected it previously. Also, if you can, find professors in your department or other departments and talk to them about whatever subject you are trying to study. It's really tricky when you get into a new subject to know what keywords to type in, or if there's an important author that everyone who's in the subject knows about but you don't and won't be able to look for. So talking to people who already know the subject is one of the best ways to learn about it. If you can, get your hands on a great big review article. Most fields of study have 1 or 2 review articles. They come out once a decade, where a main scientist just writes everything down and puts references to all the other papers that matter, and they're generally written quite well. On the flip side of that, if you find a paper which is just terribly written, don't waste days and days trying to understand it if you don't think it's relevant to what you're doing. Now, while you're doing all this literature review, something to keep in mind is that you should get yourself a citation manager. Citation managers are just programs that live on your computer. When you find a paper you like, you hit a button and it stores itself away. You can add comments, and when it comes time to write your own papers, citation managers are programs which are going to help put those citations into your article. I use Zotero. I have friends who use Mendeley. They're both really great. Getting back to the reading part of it, one of the problems that you might find when going through the literature is occasionally you'll find a really important article and it will be behind a paywall, and something like Elsevier or one of these other fairly evil corporations is going to ask you and your library to pay $1 million to read one article, which is not very helpful. Now, there are a few ways around these paywalls that you should keep in mind. The easiest one is to go and look on Archive. Archive is just a server that most mathematicians and physicists put their articles on before the article gets published. To find an article on Archive, pretty much just go to a search engine, type the article's name, and then stick the word archive at the end. Archive itself mainly has physics and mathematics, but other disciplines are getting into this too now. So you now have bioarchive, meta-archives, there's a geology archive. Generally, it is best to stick to the articles in Archive that you know have been published somewhere else. If you find an article in Archive that hasn't been published anywhere, it could just be wrong. It hasn't been published for a reason, potentially. But maybe it's right. With mathematics, it's much easier to check things for yourself. Now, if you find an article that you want to get your hands on that isn't in Archive or bioarchive or anywhere else, another option that is worth thinking about is going to the professor's personal website. There's a bunch of authors on most articles, and chances are at least one of those authors will have put up the article themselves on their personal website, and you can access it directly. Even if that isn't the case, if you go to their personal website and find out their email address, you can email them and ask them for a copy of one of their articles. Professors like their articles being read. They're going to help you out if they can. Okay, so that covers the prep work. Step 0 and 1 of figuring out what you're doing and reading the literature. The next step is just to look at the system that you're talking about and figure out what the things you need to keep track of in the system are. So what I mean by that is, let's give an example. If you've got a bunch of cities and an evil epidemic appears in one of them on February 12th, and it spreads to another city by the 21st of February, and you want to know when it's going to reach cities 3 and 4. So your question is, when's it going to get here? Well, what are the things I need to think about in order to understand what the system is doing? Well, the first thing I need to think about is, where are the sick people? How many sick people are there? And also, as well as sick people, I might want to know things about, well, how many well people there are, and how many people used to be sick and have now recovered. This is pretty much all you need to make a very, very basic epidemic model, but we're also trying to figure out space. There is some element of where things happen. So the fourth thing that we'd need for such a model is to talk about places. Okay, that's one example. We're going to use a second example just so I can contrast between things here. Let's say I want to know how a river gets its winds in it. Why do rivers coil back and forth like that instead of just going down to the sea? So the kinds of things I need to think about in this model are, how much water is there? That's going to have a huge impact on what's going on. I need to think about what shape the river is currently, because what shape it is now is going to affect what shape it's going to be in the future. I want to know how fast the water is moving. Is the water slow and languid, or is it a rushing torrent? That's going to affect what happens. And I want to know how much sediment there is in the river. Is it carrying a whole bunch of silt with it currently, or is it perfectly clear water with nothing in it? So all four of these things are things that I need to know in order to predict how the river is going to move. The next step in the process, once you've thought about the things that are in your system, is to think about the processes in your system. Think about how are things changing. So to continue on with the river example I was covering earlier, I've said, okay, we need to know how much water there is and how much sediment there is, but we also need to know how those things are moving. If the water is moving slowly, that means that the water is getting from one place to another slowly, and the sediment is moving from one place to another slowly. I need to think about rain and evaporation. I need to think about, is the rain like really heavy at one time of year and low at a different time of year, and is that going to affect how my river forms? Or maybe I don't want to model that. Who knows? And of course, because I want to model how the shape of the riverbanks are changing, I probably need to model erosion, which is where the water is scouring stuff away, and deposition, which is just where the river is dumping all the sand and silt that it scoured away elsewhere. If I go back to the other example that I was talking about of watching the spread of an epidemic through a network of cities, well, I know I'm talking about sick and well people, and what's the processes that are changing that? Well, you have infection, where a healthy person becomes sick because they come in contact with an infected person, and you have recovery, where a sick person gets better because their immune system gets on top of things. And that by themselves is enough to make an epidemic model, but I also have to worry about, okay, there's lots of different cities, so I probably want to think about how people move from one city to the next. So a third process I'm going to be thinking about is transportation. So by now, you have a system and you have a list of the things that you're expected to talk about and think about in that system. You don't have a model yet though. All you have is a list of things that you'd like to build a model out of. So the next step that we're going to talk about is how we're going to represent things. This is the heaviest step, this is the most difficult step, this is in some sense the guts of building a model. So I'm going to take a little longer on this one and go through in a bit more detail. So when I say how do we represent things, let's talk about an example of that. What does space mean in your model? Are you trying to describe the universe in 1D, 2D, or 3D? If you're trying to build a map, you're describing it in 2D. If you're trying to model atmosphere and clouds up above us, maybe you're doing it in 3D. If you've got some kind of symmetry which allows you to not think of east and west and only think of north to south, then maybe you can reduce your system to only talking about things in one dimension. You want to use as few dimensions as possible because that's going to make your analysis easier, but you have to have a certain number of dimensions to actually cover all of the phenomena that you're expecting to come into play. Once you've decided how many dimensions you're going to use, you then have to decide, okay, how are you going to represent them? So usually you represent them using continuous real values such as x, y, and z, but then you have to decide, well, is x, y, and z going to go from negative infinity to positive infinity? Do you have an unbound system? Or is it going to go from 0 to 1? You have distinct walls. This is the left side, this is the right side. Alternatively, you might not use real values at all. You might be considering things on a grid. Grids make things a lot easier if you're going to ask your computer to do a bunch of work on it. And sometimes they make sense in real life and sometimes they don't. Maybe you aren't going to use 1D, 2D, or 3D at all. Maybe you're talking about events that are happening on a sphere. If you're talking about a sphere or any kind of geometry which has some kind of degenerate point in the actual geometry of the object, such as the poles on a sphere, you have to decide how you're going to represent those and what those mean for the system that you're describing. Maybe you want to describe your system in terms of a network, which is a bit of an abstract sort of representation of space, but can be a very accurate one, especially if, say, you're dealing with computers or cities or people even. And finally, when talking about space, maybe you don't need space at all. If you're measuring the number of trout in a lake and trying to study the ecology of that lake, you probably don't care where in the lake the trout are, you just care how many of them you are. So you might choose to throw space out the window. Going back to the examples that we were dealing with earlier, if I'm modeling a river and I want to know its shape, I can model its shape in perfectly normal 2D coordinates, and this can work very well. However, these coordinates aren't really native to the river. The river doesn't know about north or south or east and west. What the river knows about is upstream and downstream, and maybe measurements across the stream, how far you are from the right-hand bank. So you might end up making a coordinate system which is more native to the river itself, but is less natural in terms of physics, which cares about sort of a set of 3 coordinates that are pointing in orthogonal directions. Which coordinate system you use is up to you. Often, if you use sort of physicsy coordinate systems, it's going to make certain parts of your equations easier and certain parts of it harder. And conversely, if you use a coordinate system which is a little bit bendy but matches more the geometry of the object you're dealing with, the parts of your equations that care about physics are going to be harder, and the parts of the equation that care about boundaries are going to be easier. And you have to decide whether or not that trade-off is worth it. Considering our other example of the day, if you've got an epidemic spreading between a bunch of different cities, you can mark out those cities on a two-dimensional map. 2D maps, often useful. And that might have been a really good way of measuring an epidemic if you're back in the 1500s caring about the Black Death. People have to walk from one city to another, so how far apart your cities are is a big representation of how hard it is to get from one to the other. But we don't live in the 1500s, and we don't walk between places. Often we fly or take the train. And so what we actually care about is how much travel there is between cities. And so you might instead choose to represent a bunch of cities as a network, where each link has on it how many flights are there, how many people went across this bridge. So that's space. Now let's talk about how you're going to represent time in your system. The easiest way to represent time is in discrete time, where you count the number of days, or perhaps if you're studying biology, you might count the number of individual generations. Another way you might study time is using continuous time. T is a real value, it goes from 0 to positive infinity, all is good. Or you might consider a system with no time in it at all. So, for example, if you wanted to talk about the level of water in a lake, you would talk about, okay, how many rivers are coming in, how much rain is there, and how many rivers are going out. And once the lake level has reached the point where the water coming in balances the water going out, it's going to be still. It's going to be in balance. Whenever you're measuring a system and trying to find its balance point, often you don't care about time, and you want to throw time out the window. In systems where you do care about time, you have to decide between continuous time and discrete time. Usually you're going to want continuous time. It's going to make your analytic work much easier. Differential equations are great, and mathematics is just better in continuous time. However, if you're dealing with people from other disciplines, they often do not like differential equations. They're weird, they're complicated, and discrete time is often a lot easier for explaining things to people outside of mathematical disciplines. And sometimes it's just the way the universe works. If you're measuring biology, generations are actually a thing to think about. Seasons are actually a thing to think about. So discrete time can be useful. Okay, so those are 3 possible ways of representing time in your system. So next let's talk about how you're going to represent your state. An example, we have some number of sick people, and I'm going to say that's a variable I'll call I for infectious. And if I'm trying to model an epidemic and when things arrive somewhere, I'm also going to say that I is a function of t. It didn't have to be, but for that kind of model, I'm going to say it is. Now, we don't just care how many infected people there are overall, we care about where they are, which city they're in. So, as an example, there might be 3 in this city, 1 in this city, and 0 in this city so far. And you could represent that using a vector. So, for this particular example, you end up with I is a vector-valued function of t. Now, next you have to decide, should this thing be a real value or a discrete value? If I'm talking about something like temperature or momentum, then real valued variables are the best way of representing that. If I'm talking about the number of sick people in a town, well, you don't really get 17.3 sick people. You either get 17 or 18. This isn't always a problem. If you have like a large number of sick people, then the difference between 1012 and 1012.3 isn't really enough that we have to think about it, and you can usually safely pretend that that value is continuous. If instead you say that you've got 3.5 patients in your hospital, I'm going to be raising my eyebrows and wondering what is going on. In that kind of case, you may be better off measuring the system, representing the system in terms of discrete numbers. So you say there was 3 sick people, and then later on there was 4 or 5 or 2. Now, this question of how do you represent the state variable and should it be real or discrete is also mixed up with another question which is quite important, which is your system stochastic or deterministic? Are you allowing probabilities to matter? Many discrete state models are stochastic. Continuous models are often deterministic, although they don't have to be. When you're talking about the question of is something discrete or stochastic, another important thing to remember is that the universe isn't stochastic. Stochastic is just a way of us saying this is a part of the system we don't want to think about. One way to picture that in your head is if you're standing somewhere at a bus stop wondering what time the bus is going to arrive, from your point of view, the arrival time of the bus is stochastic. It could be now, it could be in 10 minutes, it could be in an hour, who knows? And there is no cause to that. It's just a random event that happens. With no cause, there's no model. However, if you're the bus driver, this is not stochastic, this is deterministic. You are going to arrive in 5 minutes' time, and maybe roadworks gets in your way, but that is part of your model. It's part of the reality that you are trying to keep track of. So whether or not a part of your system is treated as stochastic or deterministic is up to you. It's, in some sense, you defining what is the boundaries of what I'm trying to model and what am I just going to treat as the big wild world out there that I don't need to think about. Okay, next thing that you have to model is how are you going to represent the processes in your system? If we talk about how a river becomes windy and stuff, well, we know that the water has convection, diffusion, and gravity, and we have to turn that into an equation somehow. Here's the Navier-Stokes equation, which covers all those things. You don't need to read and understand the equation, but the important idea here is that each of the processes that I have to think about becomes one component of this equation. Convection is this component here, diffusion is this component here. And in theory, if you're trying to build up the model in your head, you would be able to build and test each of these components individually. So you would have a model that had convection only. It would just have this change term and a convection term. Or you could have a model which was diffusion only by having a change term and just the diffusion term. So figure out the processes and figure out how to put them into your model. Now, not all of the processes are going to lead to equations in the traditional sense, and certainly not always to differential equations like the example I just gave. Any clear program is going to work. So what I mean when I say that is like, okay, let's say we have our epidemic model where people get infected and recover and travel. Instead of building differential equations, I might say the infection, recovery, and transport are exponentially distributed stochastic events that happen at some rate that I don't know yet. So they're events, they happen, and the time between them happening is exponentially distributed. And each time infection happens, we increase the number of sick people by 1 and reduce the number of healthy people by 1. And I'd also say what would happen with each of my other events. The point being is that this isn't an equation, but it is a very clear set of rules that we could put into a computer or write out as a rule book to make as a children's board game. Anything that looks like a clear set of rules that represents your thing is in some sense a model. Okay, now that was a lot, and I will admit that deciding how to represent your model is the hardest part of building a model. And I have not covered it in nearly enough detail, but it's something to keep in mind. And when you're watching all of the other presentations later on this afternoon and tomorrow, hopefully you'll be able to look at the presentations and see what kind of modeling decisions have been made. But we're not done yet, so let's move on to the next step. What's missing? By now you've got a representation, but it probably looks a little bit like this. There's just huge bits missing that you haven't covered yet. So, as an example, if we go back to our epidemic model on a network, how many flights are there between different cities? What shape? I've said that the world is a network of cities, but what shape is that network? How am I meant to find that out? How many healthy people are there in each of the cities? Because if my model cares about infection of healthy people and I don't know how many people there are, I'm going to have some problems. How fast is infection? How fast is recovery? If I don't know anything about my illness, how do I deal with those questions? So if you've got huge chunks of your model missing, there are basically 3 ways to solve these problems. You can use data, you can use assumptions, and you can use parameterization. So let's go through one of each of those now. I have a network. I don't actually know how close these things are together because I don't know how many flights there are. Heck, I've drawn a picture here, but the truth is I don't even know yet if this airport should be connected to that airport or if this connection between these 2 airports exists. I just have in my head an idea that there should be a network of some kind. I don't even have a list of airports yet. So how am I going to build this network? Well, one of the best ways to get something and put it into your model is by getting your hands on data. And as it turns out, for the global airline network, there is a lot of data available. All of these airports and all of these airlines keep data on how many flights they have between each city and how many passengers they have on those flights. And some of that data is publicly available. If you can get that data, you can use it to put numbers to all of these connections, and suddenly your model is a whole bunch more grounded. It's now a model of a thing in reality, not just a model of the idea of a network. Data is golden. It will sing a song to your soul. It is the best thing to put into your model if you can get your hands on it. There is one catch, however, and that is that data is expensive. Either someone else already has the data, as in this case, all of these airlines already have the data, but they don't really want to share it, so you might have to pay something like $10,000 or $20,000 to get your hands on some of that data. Alternatively, the data doesn't exist yet, and in order to collect data on, say, how fast an animal or a tree grows, you have to send an experimentalist out there to sit there for a few months or years measuring the thing growing. And experimentalists and lab equipment is also expensive, so collecting data in that way is really, really expensive. A few tips to get around that is to just use data that is publicly available. All of this data here came from openflights.org, which is just a free website with a whole bunch of data on it. Alternatively, you can also use previous experimental data. There is, for example, the Registry of Research Data Repositories, which just basically has that anyone who does an experiment and wants to put their data online can put it in one of these repositories, and then you can come along and use their experimental data later on. And they will love you for that, because everyone who's done hours and hours of experimentation wants people to use their data and wants people to make that data as valuable as possible. So talk to collaborators, talk to people you've never met before, send out emails, and if you see a paper that looks like the author probably has the data you need, feel free to get in touch with them and say, hey, I'd really like to use your data. Okay, let's go on to the next problem, missing part of the model. How many people are there in each city? So say I've got a little town, it's got a dozen people in it, I've got a big city, it's got a couple million people in it. I don't know how many people are in each city, and if my network is built of airports, how many people does each airport serve? Might not just be one city, it might be multiple cities, so there's a serious question there. Now, luckily in this case, we are trying to study the early stages of an epidemic. So let's say we model our epidemic and we get a couple curves like this. This is the small city, this is the big city. The big city ends up with more sick people in it, as makes sense. But we are only trying to understand what happens early on. We're trying to understand this bit right here of an infection has been introduced to a town, one infected person, and it's spreading throughout the town. So a little bit later, we have 3 infected people, or if on our graphs, it's growing exponentially like this, and you'll note that both the graphs look kind of the same. And that's because in the early stages, the disease, it doesn't know if it's in a small town or a big town yet, because it doesn't see the limits that it is growing within. And if we only are trying to model the early stages of an epidemic, we can use that to our advantage by basically just saying the number of healthy people is infinite. We're never going to run out of them, at least not in the stages we care about. And this is an example of assuming our way out of a problem. We're saying, yes, this thing exists, but we don't care about it. Now, there are 3 basic things that you're likely to find yourself assuming. Sometimes you'll assume a number is much, much less than 1. Sometimes you'll assume a number is much, much bigger than 1. And sometimes you'll have a function that is a function of time and space and all these other variables. Say, I don't know, the temperature in a room. And you might just decide it's close enough to being constant that we don't care. If I'm trying to model how fast my room is going to catch fire, and I know that it's constantly at 20 degrees Celsius or maybe 13 or 15, then I don't have to know precisely the temperature in every corner of my room. I know it's not going to catch fire. Okay, next one. What's missing? How fast is infection and how fast is recovery? Now this can be a really tricky one if, say, you're trying to model something in the future, a future event, but if a disease hasn't arrived yet, you don't know how fast infection is going to be or how fast recovery is going to be. You're talking about something that doesn't exist yet. And when you're talking about something that doesn't exist yet, often there is no way of finding out these numbers. And so what you have to do instead is you have to parameterize. You just go, okay, I don't know the infection rate. I'm going to call it alpha. I don't know the recovery rate. I'm going to call it beta. And that's the best you can do. Now, it's important to remember, every unknown parameter you include is going to make your analysis harder. You want to get rid of them. One possible way to get rid of them is to try and rescale your system. So, as an example, I might stop talking about how many people are infected in a city, and start talking about what percentage of that city is infected. What that would do is would mean that I would not need to worry about the size of the city because I've turned it into a percentage. I've rescaled things to get rid of that size of city parameter. If I don't want to think about how long infection takes, I might rescale time so that instead of talking about days or weeks, I talk about how many incubation periods until something happens, which would rescale things so that my infection rate was 1. And whatever you do with your parameters, at the end of your analysis, you probably want to figure out which parameters are most critical to the system's behavior. What I mean by that is if I do a whole bunch of analysis and I get to the end and I go, oh, if I change the infection rate by 3%, it'll make the epidemic 5 times bigger or 5 times smaller, this is a big deal. And if I change the recovery rate by 3%, nothing much happens. That would also be important to note. Please note, those were just examples. Real epidemics do not work that way. The final thing to remember about parameters is that sometimes determining the value of a parameter is actually the point of the model. So if I want to know the infection rate, maybe I have a bunch of data and my job is to find out what alpha is. So it's actually important to have that parameter in the model, and I get that parameter and compare it to data, and I go, okay, if alpha was equal to 1.2, then my model looks like my data, and that is good. Maybe alpha is something close to 1.2. Okay, So that was missing things in your model. There are 3 ways to solve that. That's great. We're nearly at the end of this presentation, so let's brush through the last bits. The final step is evaluation. And by evaluation, I just mean look at your model and decide if it makes any sense whatsoever. There are lots of ways of doing that. One is get your model, stick into a computer, and see if you can get the computer to run a copy of your model and see if it spits out useful results. And also see if you can get the simulation to run at all. If your simulation takes 17,000 years to run, then you may have a problem. Or you might not. That might just be a sign you need to solve things analytically. If you do run a simulation, then does the system explode to infinity? Or do things become negative when they shouldn't? Are you getting negative probabilities? That might be a bad sign. Do your units make sense? Are you adding time to number of sick people and getting meters cubed? If that happens, this is probably a very, very bad sign. You should probably be checking this while building your model. Is your model simple enough that you can understand what is going on? Maybe not the whole system, but if your model looks like this, it's going to be really hard to learn anything from your model. Try and keep your system as simple as possible. Remember, when you have a map of a city, the map is useful because it's a lot smaller than the city you're trying to navigate through. And finally, remember why you made this model in the first place. You weren't just building a bunch of equations just for the fun of it. You were actually trying to solve a problem. So, based on the model you've created, do you think that model is capable of solving the problem? You don't have to have the solution yet, but just figure out, are you on track? If your model doesn't involve time, but the problem you're trying to solve involves time, then maybe you need to include a few extra things. And that's it. That's the beginner's guide to building a model. As a quick reminder, the steps were, where are you starting? Read as many of the past papers as you can. Figure out what things you need to keep track of. Figure out what processes you need to keep track of. Decide how you are going to represent those things. This is the hard part. Look at what's missing and use data, assumptions, and parameters to fill those gaps. And then finally, evaluate your model and decide, is it up to scratch and doing what you need it to do? Now, that was very quick. I'm sure that you all have a bunch of questions. I'll be at the panel talk in a couple hours' time, so I will see you all there. Have an excellent afternoon.
Thank you for your great talk, Dr. Alistair. Once again, questions for our speakers will be answered later. So please don't forget to write down your questions in your own notes and type them later in the chat box during the open forum. Before we proceed, I would like to recognize the presence of Dr. Alistair here in our Zoom meeting. Okay, let's proceed to the next plenary talk.
Our next plenary speaker is Dr. Wolfgang Bock. He is a permanent lecturer at the Technical University of Kaiserslautern since April 2016 and a visiting professor at the Mindanao State University Ligan Institute of Technology since October 2020. He received his PhD studies at TU Kaiserslautern studying functional analysis, stochastic analysis, numerical methods for stochastic differential equations, and mathematical physics, and his postdoctoral fellowship in University of Lisbon studying statistical mechanics, fractional processes, and polymer physics. His recent scientific consulting and scientific networks involve studying and modeling the COVID-19. Let us listen to Dr. Wolfgang as he talks about hybrid random graph and ODE models, a space mapping approach to disease dynamics.
Once again, let's welcome Dr. Wolfgang Bock. Dr. Wolfgang.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Dr. Wolfgang, we can hear you clearly. Can you share your presentation, Dr. Wolfgang?
I will try my very best to do so. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Super. So thanks for a nice invitation and giving me the opportunity to talk here today. I changed my talk a bit, as you have seen, so it's not really that what was just announced, but it's fine. So my idea is to talk about disease dynamics in micro and mesoscale, which has really to do with that what I wanted to talk about. And some things you maybe have seen already in the talk of Till Krüger, because as you see, I'm also part of the MOCOS International Research Group, which means we also do research together. So this I will definitely talk about when I talk about the COVID methods, COVID research that we're doing. But there are also two other collaborations with co-workers from TU Kaiserslautern. One is more on the dengue disease model, and the other one you will see is also on COVID-like models, which has something to do with the pedestrian dynamics. So what do I want to do today? So micro mesoscale, I mean, these are two names which are a bit strange. Maybe what do I mean with that? So microscopic models, what I mean with microscopic models, and one has to be careful if you talk with other people, then usually microscopic is not so clearly defined what it means. For me, it means agent to agent. That means really like a disease is spread, while the mesoscale is talking actually about densities. So we are on the spatiotemporal densities, while then the macro scale would be that what you know from the classical SIR models, ODE models, which are somehow counting the incidences, right? And I want to stay today in the micro and the mesoscale, and I want to show you in this talk how you get from the micro to the mesoscale and what you can do with it at the end of the day. Yeah. First, a small disclaimer. So MOCOS means modeling corona spread, and was founded actually by Till Krüger last year. So I was in Iligan in that time when he founded MOCOS. I think it was around February 2020, and became now in a very, very successful project, especially in Poland. I mean, he has definitely talked about that. They are consultants for the local and also for the whole Polish government. They are very, very successful in the European forecast hub. So we have a much smaller group of MOCOS Germany, as you see, where we also do some simulations for Germany, but not in that extent as the Polish group will do. Right, and there's lots of MOCOS Philippines, which is affiliated. Most all of them are affiliated at MSD IIT in Iligan. And you see also there I am somehow consulting, so that's why my name WB is there. And we are also somehow consultants for the local LGU units, let's say. Good. So if you talk about modeling, so you should know what you model, and well, there are many, many problems in modeling, as you know. I'll give you typical problems in Philippines, for example. This was in, I think in April or May last year. You see that that you have a lot of different data coming in, and you have especially a lot of if you are in the pandemic situation as we are now, or it's actually generally for diseases. You have somehow a lot of new data coming in, and also new findings by medical doctors and whatever. So you always have to stand on the top of the disease and to check, okay, do I have to adapt my parameters and whatever. And there can be data which is misleading. For example, on the left-hand side, you see The total cases of the Philippines is until October 2020. I just took that one, and you see that you have almost linear growth, and the linear growth comes from the exceeding of test capacities. It's not really that you have just a linear growth and everything else is going exponentially, but here you have really like a problem because you are the daily testing limit. The same you see on the right hand side. This is a picture that Mokos Philippines did for us. This was also in the early days. The yellowish marked regions in the Philippines are those where you had COVID cases at that time, while the blue ones are testing centers. And if you look at it closely, you see actually there were testing centers. You have a lot of people which are sick. So you could actually find a correlation between testing centers and sick people. One has, of course, to be careful. That means just that if you know how the testing was in that time, there were also not enough test kits, as we know, as it was in every part of the world almost. Then you just tested people around this region. And this is very hard then to use that as a reliable data. So there were people writing, for example, also articles about one should put a lot of more effort into Manila, and because otherwise there are somewhere else there are no cases and whatever. But one has to be careful if we build models on that. If you don't test in the other regions, there are no cases, and this is something that always is a problem with modeling diseases. So you have to be very careful about your data, and you have to be careful about what you really know, right? So it doesn't matter on which scale you model, if you model on mesoscale, microscale, macroscale. It is very important that you can analyze the underlying data in such a way that you can say, okay, this I believe, here I maybe has to get some more insight. This is a bit doubtful what happens here, right? And at the end of the day, this is a tragedy of the predictions, yeah. This is also a slide which Till Krüger also uses quite often, I think, and it's so nice because it shows you. This is really like the number one slide for modelers, actually, because you see. You have to predict something, and you see here this two man and woman talking with each other via telegraph, having antenna on their heads, and of course the prediction is completely wrong. We are not running around with antenna, right? And we also are not having some telegraphs with us. But if you think about the mobile phones and how we are connected via Instagram or Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp and whatever, this comes quite close to that what's now. So we have good predictions, we have bad predictions, and we have to be careful that what we want to predict or that what we want to model actually is can be reached by the methods that we use. Yeah. So if I need, for example, something which I have to model in or I need results in 1 hour, it is maybe not a good choice to go to a very complicated, very sophisticated model, because this needs a lot of time to maybe compute. Yeah. But if I need very, very detailed information about things, it is maybe a good way to choose a very good microscopic model which is coping with these things. So it is not that every complex model is better than non-complex models. Yeah. You can also come to overfitting. That modelers know that if you put too many things inside, then you don't see anything anymore. And most models which are used today are not really like quantitative ones, but especially in disease, but they are qualitatively. That means you try to think about or to shape some insights in order to have a forecast. Yeah. And this is somehow that what was very helpful in this pandemic up to now, that we know if we do this and this, the numbers rise or the numbers go down. Yeah. And This is something that a model should do, invariant of that what I'm talking now about today. So which classes we have? Typically, if you go to mathematical biology classes, which most maybe some of you did, you are in this section and maybe in this section. So a lot of models are actually done by the compartmental models, the classical SIR models. So you divide your population into susceptible, infected, and removed or recovered people. And then you say that you have ODEs, so ordinary differential equations, which are prescribing your disease progression, actually. And then if you want to do this a bit more sophisticated, you can, for example, put a metapopulation model, which is also called sometimes multi-patch model, which is that you link somehow either age groups or regional groups with this SIR model by saying that they can interchange with each other. Yeah. So the easiest thing is, for example, just think about your local region, and you go to your next region. So one region is patch 1, one region is patch 2, and then you have just migration between them, let's say, or some commutation due to people have to go to work, to school, whatever. And then, of course, you have a mixing of this, and these metapopulation models are quite popular right now because they give you some geometrical and geographical information. The other thing that I think that Till was talking about today was network model. I will talk about this also in some seconds a bit more and describe a bit how this works. So this is a typical graph theoretical models. Then we have individual based models. This is one big part of my talk today, and also spatial models. So these three somehow, that's what I will talk about later. While this one, this spatial model is actually not on this scale, but it's on the scale of pedestrian groups, but it's also spatial, and it tells you about spatial interaction of individuals. Yeah. So this is the class of models you usually have. Of course, there are now, not to make people from machine learning sad, there are of course machine learning models, statistical models, and stuff like that. But I'm talking about really like you make a physical interpretation in the sense that you try to represent your disease dynamics directly. Yeah, you're not working directly on the data and try to statistically predict your disease, but it's more like you have some physical model which is giving you the insight. Okay, so these are classes, and we will start with the microscopic agent-to-agent models. So on the micro scale, as I said, is agent-to-agent. You have different possibilities to do that and to model that. The easiest one, I think, is cellular automata that you could do with school kids. Then you will just let particle run randomly around, and if they hit or are in cells next neighboring cells, then you have some probability that the disease jumps right to them, or can flip, or you can infect, and then you can already get some quite nice results already. But if you want to go to analysis, then in microscopic scale, usually it's getting a bit more involved. Yeah. So the first one I want to talk about is the random graph theory a bit, not too much, because I think there was talk also before. But if you talk about microscopic models in reality, we talk about huge systems of many particles. So let's say I want to do the whole population of the Philippines. Okay, then I'll talk about 100 million agents, and they all can possibly infect everybody. So everybody can infect everybody. So at the end of the day, you have particles which can do different things. So for example, if you have a long time disease like tuberculosis, then birth and death can play a role. Yeah. So what happens in your population meanwhile, while you have TB in your population for 20 years, then birth and death of particles or of individuals makes sense. talk about. Then what you can have is that possibly if two meet, then you get that this susceptible one gets infected. You can have that also that the more, let's say, infected are around you, the more likely you should be infected, of course, and you can have a possible change if you are infected to be recovered. That's usually what you can, for example, say. And so about this process of infection, you can now really try to model this on that side by data you get from medicine. Yeah, so you check medical journals, what is known about the disease, and you do that. The problem is that the more particles are involved, because you have these interactions here, you can think about this is a minimum. If all are interacting with each other, you have an n square, and if this is huge, you have a very, very costly interaction kernel already, and then some more kernels are coming. So this is very costly to compute, but it can cope with more heterogeneities than anything else. So you can really assign features to this elements, to these agents. I can tell them, okay, one is female. Yeah, they can tell this guy is 65 years old. He is a mechanic, and he is living in I don't know, Bagoya or something like this. Yeah, I could actually put that. Yeah, and that means I can really model on a very, very, very good scale. I can really model very fine, very detailed with this model or with these models. So and one way to do this quickly, or to do this less costly than the interaction of all with each other and running around, is for example, graph theory or random graphs. So you have n nodes, large n, of course, and the edges represent here the relations. So here the infectious contacts. Yeah, so you have an edge comes when you have an infectious contact. You have a connectivity parameter, which is telling you how they are connected, and they are connected with a certain probability, which is so two nodes are connected with this constant, so connectivity over the number of nodes. And the number of neighbors is usually Poisson distributed. So you get something like such a picture. And then you can play around with your connectivity parameter. And what happens, and I think that this was already described before, is that you have a sudden change of that what you call a giant component. So, I mean, the problem is always when you have something like a connected graph, you don't want to have this a big component inside of that, which can infect a lot of people. So your connectivity should not be too large, because the small ones you can always somehow control. So when you have a big giant component, then you have a problem, and that's what exactly you can say that this is like the appearance of the of an overcritical epidemic. Yeah? So you jump from non-critical to overcritical. This you can do at the c equal to 1. So you could see this in some sense as a basic reproduction number or the equivalence of it. Yeah. And SIR dynamics, said, yeah, you have also the susceptible infected removal category. So you have categories at your nodes. The edges represent the infectious contacts. A connected component is a set here of individuals which can eventually be infected, so which are in connection with each other. And you want to control the giant component. So you can, for example, now say, okay, build household bubbles that makes the giant component or the connectivity smaller, or don't leave your household. That means also you have small small components here. And right. At the end, you get something like this here, which is the Erdős-Rényi graph. The Mokos model itself is more on this Riordan-Bolobash graphs. So this is a bit more involved, but I think that Till already discussed about that. What I want to say is a bit about the numerics here, or let's say about the model. So you have different kernels. So you have household, you have friendship kernels. So you can have a network on families and whatever. If you do that, you have always to adapt your current state to that what is known. Let's say you start with a vanilla population. You say there's patient 1, yeah, you let it run, and then you benchmark your parameters, because the problem is somehow that in between your parameters are changing, right? So your government doesn't let you run into a pandemic usually without doing anything. So they will do something, and then your parameters change. So you always have to adapt that. You always have to benchmark these things. So this is a bit more also costly. But as you see, you can do really modeling on different ways. Yeah, and you can put more and more ingredients, and this makes this model so successful. Yeah, you can see what is a change of this and this parameter, of this and this structure doing in my model. Okay. Another thing what you can do is you can now not work on graphs, but you can work on agents, really like free floating people, like particles running around. Particles can infect somebody. So this is a microscopic dengue model, which I did with my PhD student Isti Rodia and Torben Fatler already some years ago. Isti is now also on the Helmholtz Institute for Infectious Diseases in Germany. And this model is on configuration spaces. So this is a bit hard from the theory. You could also do it on R2 actually with ODEs. I'll talk about this in the last part a bit, but here configuration space is actually quite nice. And for those of you who are a bit more related to measure theory and to set theory, like that a bit more, it's maybe an interesting part to step in. So how it is with dengue, I don't have to explain you. I mean, Germany is no dengue country. We don't have mosquitoes because we have winter. So we have mosquitoes, but they are not transmitting dengue too much. So what usually happens is you have an uninfected human, you have an infected human, you have an uninfected mosquito, an infected mosquito, and a mosquito can infect itself with an infected human, then carry the blood to another human and infect it. Yeah, so you have not direct human to human transmission. You have always the mosquitoes in between. Yeah, and the aim what I will show today, or what we did, is actually we set up a mathematical model based on the configuration space analysis and derived kinetic equations from it. So we went from the particle system, the interacting particle system, to the corresponding PDE by saying, okay, I'm not anymore interested if this is this particular person, but I say I have something like a density of persons at a certain point. So there are 1.3 infected persons, for example, at a certain area, and I want to know the dynamics of this thing. Yeah? And this is what we derived here. This is so-called the kinetic equations. So what you do here is you play around like in cellular automata. There's like this configuration space so much. You can actually the dynamics, what's behind and how you model that, you can explain somebody in primary school. The problem is to write it down and to do the kinetic equations and to do the measures is a bit more involved. Yeah? So that you cannot explain somebody in primary school. But let's say the dynamics, what happens actually at the end when you see the generator of the dynamics, that you can understand immediately, I can tell you. So what you do? Well, you work now on infinite many particles. This has a reason. In physics, it is known that an infinite particle system is approximating a big system better than a finite particle system. It has different reasons, which I don't want to go into detail here too much, but this is what happens. But you say you have to have a handle on it. So let's say you take some compact interval out. So let's say you draw a circle of any length, of any radius, and in any of these you have just finite many. Okay, This is called the configuration space. That means you put particles inside of your world, let's say R2, and then you draw a circle, and the circle tells you, okay, inside you have just finite many. Okay, and then you have a K transform, which is transforming from an observable to this here. So you take some sub-configuration, which is finite. So you sum over all sub-configurations, and you have a function which is defined on this configuration. So what is this strange observable? Just think about anything which has to do with these particles. Let's say, for example, the easiest thing is the number of particles inside of eta. So eta is a collection of particles, of points in R2. And now you want to know how many are this. This is, for example, one observable. Very easy. And you see that this guy is even finite. Yeah? So it's super. So that's the configuration space. And now you can think about what can I do with that. Well, you give now everybody of these small dots a head, which is Dirac delta, and then you build you ask yourself, how does this configuration change? So you have this some of these configuration measures here, and you can now build with this K a correlation measure, and this correlation measure tells you somehow this relation. So this here is the space of finite configurations. If you have an observable integrated with respect to correlation measure, this is nothing else but this transform we just have seen, where you just sum up over all finite configurations of this observable with respect to this mu of, let's say, all the measures where all the points have a Dirac delta on the head. Okay, so that is correlation measure, and now you can ask yourself. We can consider now functions, which these observables on this, just saying by integrating out a function with respect to this mu. If we have a measurable function, if you have a proper bona fide defined probability measure, we assume we have that right now. And we have some, let's say we have some initial conditions, and these initial conditions of the system, they are inside of a probability measure mu0, which tells you, okay, this is really like, where are the particles? Yeah. So this is like really like, it tells you this particle is there, this particle is there at the beginning. This is really like a the initial state. And then the question is, if you let this now run through time, actually, of course, these particles are hopping. So these configurations are changing, because particles are now configurations. We identified with them. So I can say mu t should change. So I can say I don't ask about gamma, it asks about the measure. Okay, and that was what I do. So then I get here that what you call the evolution of states. So the time derivative of f with mu t is equal to an operator L on the observables. This is our generator with respect to mu t. So we have this here. Then we can come to some certain correlation functions. Correlation functions are, in some sense, the densities of these states. Yeah, and they tell us really like the density. Actually, it's really like, maybe some of you have known from the BBGKY hierarchy. So yeah, it is really like the different correlations, first order, second order, third order correlations of functions. And if you do that, then you get such a crazy Markov pre-generator. Now this is for the host. This looks super complicated, but look what it does. You take configuration. These are all the susceptibles. That's why I put an S here. This is a potential which tells you, if I have here mosquitoes around, these are all infected mosquitoes, and I have a particle inside of the susceptible configuration, I have some certain transmission probability. This is that what you would call beta when you have a normal differential equation model. And then you have the observable on this here. So you have something like a particle X, this X here, is leaving the susceptible configuration and goes to the infected configuration. So what is written here is nothing else but infection. Yeah, here you have that a susceptible is coming back from the infected. So this is recovery. If I just have two compartments here, this one means I have from the susceptible, one X is taken out and there is a Y coming. That means I just hop from X to Y. This is some jump kernel over it. The same I can do somehow with the infected. Yeah. So I can now really like put like set theoretical equations to or set theoretical operators or operations to generate my dynamics. Yeah, so it's like cellular automata, but now I have something like an analysis for it. And now these correlation functions come in the game, and you have to close them. So you can see that if you have the first correlation functions depend on second correlation function, second on the third, and so on. So you can go on. Great. So at the end of the day, you don't talk about infinite many particles, you talk about infinite many correlation functions. You don't win anything with it. So what you have to do is you have to close the system. So you have to cut after some certain functions, but you have to do it in such a way that this makes sense. And there are different limits to do that. One is the Vlasov limit. And if you do the Vlasov limit, some of you know maybe as mean field limit. So after some Vlasov scaling, you get these equations for the densities of the particles. And now look at it. This is very, very nice. You have here the time derivative of KTS is going to, you have here the correlation function of SV. That means the correlation function between first order of susceptibles and the mosquitoes. You have here a transmission potential. This guy tells you, am I close to my mosquito? And this guy tells you some transmission probability, some transmission rate, let's say. So if you look at that, you say this is beta, this would be S times V. Then this here is nothing else but that what you also get out in the SIR model. Yeah, so I would have to integrate this out again in X, and I would really get an SIR model. But you have much more. This here is actually in every point an SIR model. So I really get it spatially. I have a spatial temporal definition or spatial temporal system for my disease. So I can say, for example, what happens at a certain point. That's very beautiful. And it reveals back the SIR model. That means that the micro model is going to the SIR model we know already from dengue. If you look at the statistics, it's actually quite nice. You have something like a model hierarchy. And now you can also just count the numbers in this. So you just can count the cases. You integrate over some certain range, and you see that this is perfectly fine working for some parameters of beta with the standard SIR model or SIS model. No? So this is for the susceptible host, infected host. So this works actually quite nice. We did this also for the SIS model at the beginning, of course, to understand that. And there we just played around with this nice potential here. So we can say the potential is equal to 1. That means all of them are infected equally. Or I can send the potential is localized. That means only people near close to me are infected by myself, for example. So if you do that in the SIS model, you see that if you have the full support of the measure of the infection potential, so 1 for everybody in the room, so they have all the same, you come to the classical SIR model with the same beta H. And if you localize it, then actually what you get is you get a weaker beta. So this potential plays a key role. The choice of the potential plays really a key role, and it's really the role of this beta. Right. So this is how you get from the micro model to the macro model. So you go from, you put on every head of a particle a Dirac delta, you go to a measure, you try to get the correlation function, then you close the correlation function. You get infinite many correlation functions if you have infinite many particles. So you close the system at some certain point by a scaling limit, and then you come to a PDE, and at the end, if you integrate out a PDE, you come to ODE. Yes, and so this system here is already on the mesoscale because you have a PDE. That's what I would say it's already meso, because you talk about the density of particles. You cannot say this is really the particle in X1 I named before, for example. Yeah, so this is really like the densities. And this you can also do on a different level. So, for example, that what we did here for dengue, this you can do this for a quite big region. What we now did recently, beginning of the year, with Parvina Shamim, she's a PhD student in TU Kaiserslautern, and Axel Klar and Sudarshan Tiwari, is that we coupled this actually, what we have just seen, with the pedestrian crowd dynamics. So you go to mesoscopic model now. You also have coupled PDE systems. You have a scaling limit usually coming from microscopy, as we have seen, and it's moderate computation cost, and still you can cope with some heterogeneities, but not as in the microscopic level. So we cannot anymore say something about household structure and things like that. This is much too complicated if the particles just hop around. Yeah, contact structures are somehow blurred a bit. They are after scaling in this averaged in this potential. So what you do is you take the usually huge model for social forces, which means take just the standard Euler equations. So what happens is the time derivative of a particle's position is its speed. That means if I just know so if I derived where a particle is, then I get the speed of the particle. This is somehow clear. And derivation of the speed is given by the forces. Yeah, so you have some forces which are depending on the interaction of particles. These are these here, and the interactions can here be on the velocity, but also on the space variable, plus some. Yeah, this is something that we call desired acceleration pedestrian model. So either you have some certain target you want to go, or you want to follow some certain equation or whatever. And we have some interaction force. The interaction force is given here by an attractive repulsive potential. Yeah, it's just that if you are too close to somebody, you want to get rid of him. If you are alone and nobody is around you, you wish somebody is coming to you. So you have an attractive repulsive potential. Yeah? So repulsive close to you, attractive if you are far away. And you have some desired acceleration, which is given by such a term. Yeah. So rho here is the also density of particles in the ball of radius r around this xi. Yeah, so we have some relaxation time here, and this is some corresponding function which we give. So what do you do? What I do now in disease spread, as you talk exactly on the desired quantity, is the distribution of pedestrians. So you have here these distribution functions of that, and the corresponding PDE looks like that. So dfk is equal to velocity times the gradient x, fk plus rfk equal to tk. And now we have, of course, to say what all of this is. So we have a distribution of susceptible, exposed, and infected pedestrians. We have some operator r, which is nothing else but given by this desired by the derivative with respect to velocity of the desired attraction minus the convolution of u with the rho of x and the gradient of it. Yeah, so this is somehow that what r of x is doing, or fk of x is doing, which you get actually all out after scaling already. And here at the moment you see we don't have any disease yet. This is just for pedestrians, and we just want to let them walk around. Yeah. So, and again, we have this potential. And now this operator T are defined, and this TKs here. These are now where we couple the system with the disease equations from before. So we have here the recovery, and here we have the infection. Yeah, we have here again infections are coming. Yeah, and then we have here some exposed compartment. Because we have some time scale where you usually don't directly infect somebody. So if you have a pedestrian crowd, our aim is to check who is vulnerable, right? So it's not like I have COVID, I'm in a crowd, and immediately the guy next to me has COVID and is infectious. Yeah. So you expose him. You have infected people, you have susceptible people, you have exposed people. And in the time frame of our simulation, of course, the people from E don't go to I. Yeah, that's one has to say. That's why we need this in exposed compartment here, just because of the time frame. No? Right. And then the hydrodynamic model looks like that. You can do moment closure as before, and you have then such an equation again, where on the right-hand side you have this integral over this TK operators with respect to dV, and the second equation is telling you the velocities. So, and then at the end of the day, with all of this explicitly, you can do numerical simulations. So we have done this here with standing obstacle. Yeah, so you have the red ones are exposed ones, the blue ones are infected ones, and you see actually that it's if you are standing quite long time next to an infected one, and it's in such a way that you are actually moving along with the same speed, yeah, then you have a higher potential to be infected. The same we have here done also, for example, like moving objects. So we have some avoidance for the pedestrians with these moving objects. So there's a car coming, and how is this pedestrian crowd then, for example, interacting with this? So observations, dependence is of the infections is so you have a high dependence on the relative velocity of the agents. Yeah, so we have you have neglected the contact time. You could put contact time 2. For bidirectional flows, so where you have people running inside, the number of exposed pedestrians much higher if the influence of the contact time is neglected, otherwise not. It's also clear because if you run against each other and you run quick along each other, and you don't have too many people which are exposed or which are infected in the pedestrian crowd, actually the time of a single interaction is quite short. And therefore, flow with obstacle, the number of exposed pedestrians is also considerably increased because you somehow, because you want to avoid collision with the car, you of course jump into your neighbor, and then you squeeze actually there together, and then you have a much more condensed dynamic. So there you have more particles. You have much more density at that point. Right. Good. That is what I wanted to discuss about today. So thank you for your attention, and I really made it in 45 minutes. So if you have any questions, of course, there's the Q&A. Don't hesitate to ask via email also. It's no problem at all. Yeah, I will try to answer your questions. Yeah, thank you very much.
Daghang salamat, Dr. Wolfgang, sa imong maayong pagpresentar. I heard that you can understand and speak a little Cebuano or Bisaya. Is that right?
Walay sapayan. Of course.
Again, thank you very much, Dr. Wolfgang, for your informative talk. And we will see you later again during the open forum.
Okay. Then, see you then. Bye-bye.
Yes. Thank you again, Dr. Wolfgang. Before we move on to the next plenary speaker, let's have a short pahulay. Pahulay is a Cebuano term for break. And during the break, an AVP will be played, and I will see you later after the video.
Mathematical models of infectious disease dynamics have a long history, and they continue to mature with ongoing advances in computational tools and access to disease incidence data. They provide an important tool for understanding disease dynamics, evaluating potential control strategies, and predicting future outbreaks. Also, they can be used during an ongoing outbreak. The models can project how infectious diseases will progress to show the likely outcome of the epidemic and accordingly help inform public health interventions. Well, the models we have available so far allow us to investigate various interventions and their relative impacts on flattening the curve of the COVID-19 epidemic in the country. For example, they can give us qualitative warnings about the possible dangers of lifting interventions too early or keeping them on for a long time and risking a second wave of infections afterwards. This can also show us to what extent the health systems will be burdened by such measures. Well, models in general run on assumptions, and those assumptions change as new data becomes available. Since COVID-19 is still a new virus, there are important things we still don't know about it, which makes simulating its spread particularly challenging. As models mature over time, with the emergence of new data, their projections will also keep changing and maturing accordingly. With every addition of new evidence, the model becomes more complex and moves a step closer to simulating reality. But we are still far from that with COVID-19. They try to, but these predictions are based on assumptions that need to be taken into consideration and should be compared across multiple, equally plausible scenarios. Still, models are not magic crystal balls that can predict future numbers. They are just one of many tools that can be used by decision makers, all of which rely on the collection and analysis of high-quality epidemiological data. You can think of them as weather forecasts, which simulate a projection based on past experience and present determinants. WHO is working with an international network of universities, agencies, and institutes to develop models and discuss their adaptation for the region and its countries. For example, we currently have a collaboration with the COVID-19 International Modeling Consortium, also known as COMO, initiated by the University of Oxford in the UK. We support countries in their use of models and help them understand their benefits and their limitations. In countries that already have capacities to develop national models, we provide technical support to review their model schemas and assumptions. We also help them interpret their outputs and cross-validate the results against ones produced by other models. This includes the use of forecasting tools that try to estimate quantities and costs of essential supplies and health workforce. The bottom line is, decision-making should rely mainly on collection and interpretation of high-quality epidemiological data. Models can guide decisions, but not dictate them.
So this is the end of the live stream for day 1 of the IWOMB 2021. So our live stream viewers, see you on day 3. That's on June 11, 9 a.m. Again, to our live stream viewers, see you on the day 3 of the IWOMB 2021. That's on June 11 at 9 a.m.